Hi, I'm Sara.
And I'm Rena, and welcome to
Biopic, a podcast story. This is a podcast where we dissect the good, bad, ugly, and absurd of this specific genre of motion picture, the biopic. If you want to learn more about us, our scoring system, and how we choose movies, please check out our special introductory episode, Introduction, Who Are We and What Are We Doing?
Sara, what movie are we doing this week?
This week, we will be talking about Ray. And Rena, can you give us the trigger warning?
This movie contains depictions of drug abuse, emotional abuse, racism, sort of gaslighting your spouse and then just admitting what you did and trying to make excuses, racism, child death, grinding poverty, prejudice against the disabled, and childhood disease that looks really icky on camera. It also contains the use of a 6-letter word starting with the letter N that Cleve Jones called the word that absolutely no white person is ever allowed to say in a quote from our Milk episode, and equally offensive variants on the aforementioned revolting ethnic slur. Sara, can you think of anything that I may have left out?
No, I think that covers it. And not only is that word used, but they're hot out of the gate with it. Like the opening credits haven't finished before they start using that word. And Rena, can you give us the spoiler warning?
Spoiler warning. We are going to spoil everything, including possibly the major plot points in works of narrative art having nothing to do with this particular movie. Consider yourself warned.
Some of the sources we used in this episode include vast swaths of the internet and 2 episodes of A History of Rock Music in 500 Songs, which were specifically about Ray Charles.
Sara, can you please tell us a little bit about Ray Charles and the movie Ray?
Ray Charles Robinson was an American singer, songwriter, and pianist. He is regarded as one of the most iconic and influential musicians in history and was often referred to by contemporaries as the genius. His style and success in the genres of rhythm and blues and jazz had an influence on a number of highly successful artists, including Elvis Presley, Aretha Franklin, Stevie Wonder, Van Morrison, and Billy Joel. And the movie Ray is a 2004 biographical musical drama focusing on 30 years in the life of Ray Charles. This was an independently produced film, co-produced and directed by Taylor Hackford. It was written by James L. White from a story developed by Taylor Hackford and James L. White. It stars Jamie Foxx in the title role, along with Kerry Washington, Clifton Powell, Harry Lennox, Terrence Howard, Lorenz Tate, Richard Schiff, and Regina King in supporting roles. Along with Hackford, the film was also produced by Stuart Benjamin, Howard Baldwin, and Karen Baldwin. And I guess going with our new feature, Awards Talk, 2004, the year of the 77th Academy Awards. I would say the early 2000s were a peak era. There's many of the I'm playing someone and I'm getting a prize for it. So 3 of the 5 Best Picture nominations are for biopics. 4 out of 5 of the Best Actor nominations are for biopics. And the only original characterization in that category is Clint Eastwood, and hard pass, stop giving him awards. 3 of the 5 Best Supporting Actress nominations are for biopics. This was just like not the most amazing year for filmmaking. Also worth noting, I know that this falls into your boring categories, but Best Editor was won by Thelma Schoonmaker for The Aviator. And this was another occasion in which she won Best Editor, but Scorsese lost for Best Picture and Best Director for The Aviator, which, fine. I personally don't think that movie is his finest hour. And the big winner this year was $1 Million Baby, which I don't care for that movie. And the big miracle of the year is that The Passion of the Christ wasn't nominated for Best Picture, Director, or Actor. And that is not only peak biopic, because it's about Jesus, and it's in Aramaic, but it's also super Oscarbatory filmmaking. And I was happy to see that it wasn't nominated in any major categories.
My thought on Fox beating DiCaprio is this is sort of tangential to Robert Downey Jr.'s Tropic Thunder speech that is one of those things that we keep coming back to. Of course, playing a handicapped musician is going to be playing someone who's just a crazy person.
I mean, he was a mentally ill playboy, which I guess is, I mean, it's still hot. And this is a very meh year in filmmaking. This is like a dark period for the Oscars.
But also, Ray and Walk the Line are the two biggest sources for Dewey Cox. So you see a lot of things here that Dewey Cox subsequently brings up as this happens everywhere.
So this is the first time I've watched Ray. And
me too.
I think that is to its detriment because I am familiar with Dewey Cox and also deeply problematic. And it's no fault of anyone's here. But, you know, this is our third biopic about very influential Black artist during this era in the music industry. So there were some things in this that like felt like retreads, and it's 100% unfair for me to say that because this was kind of like the seminal point. I know like we rag on The Doors and have kind of referred to it as our platonic ideal of an and then screenplay. And as a journey through the world with trope Navajo standing very close by. But this comes mighty close to that.
Yeah, trope Navajo definitely shows up. We have a furniture smashing scene, which is something that Dewey Cox noted always happens in these things.
First, I would love to just touch for like a half a second here on Taylor Hackford, the director. He's a super accomplished filmmaker. I would put him in the same area of filmmaking as like Alan Parker and James Mangold, in that he's very accomplished. He never has any sort of like touches to it where you say like, well, this is a Taylor Hackford movie, but he makes a solid movie. But like, he's never going to have a cult of personality around him. Opening credits look great. We open on Ray Charles playing the piano, and then we open on him in a parking lot getting on a bus to go to Seattle. And we hear our first instance of the N-word, and he gets told to sit on the back of the bus, which he does. And then we go into like Inception level flashbacks, into flashbacks, into flashbacks.
He tells the bus driver that he lost his vision fighting at Normandy. We subsequently cut back, and I had thought, based on what I knew about Ray Charles, wait a minute, I thought he went blind as a little boy. And then you realize he lied to this racist bus driver, and I don't blame him at all. I have no problem with him lying to this bus driver in order to get treated properly.
We're seeing the grinding poverty in which he grew up and everything in the flashback. This cast is stacked with incredibly talented people who also like just drift in and out. One thing that this movie keeps incredibly real is the way people just like walk out of your life sometimes and you never see them again. Like we meet Quincy Jones, and Quincy Jones is in and then out of the movie.
For all we know, they're meeting on the regular, but it's not relevant to the plot. And this is already close to 2.5 hours of movie.
Yes. It's interesting that they choose to be real about that, but then to completely make up the part where he's banned from performing in Georgia. Spoiler alert, which is infuriating. So he goes to perform at a club, and it's half full and kind of like meh, and he's going to audition to play there, and he gets to try weed for the first time, which Trope is right there next to us being like, dun, dun, dun. Like, you know, it's a bad thing that he's trying weed for the first time. And he gets the gig because he is a very talented musician.
Yes, I was disappointed to learn that Oberon, the little person host, was not real. He was based on another host in a different city. And then Marlene was a version of another woman. Marlene is this woman who takes an unfair cut of Ray's money and uses him for sex.
People are ripping him off constantly in this movie to the point where it's difficult to know who's telling the truth about who's being ripped off at a certain point. I feel like Jamie Foxx as an actor did a really good job kind of conveying the isolation, and the film did a good job backing that up and conveying it through the art of filmmaking. What it is like to be blind, without like taking us like into a place where they're like, here's a blindfold to put on. But another thing that the movie reinforces that I thought was really powerful was that he insists on being paid in ones, because that enables him to count his money and know that he is not being ripped off.
Terrence Howard is playing a guy that he plays with for a bit, who's also ripping him off. And who else? Bunk from The Wire is in this.
I love Wendell Pierce so much. I'm always so happy to see him.
And Richard Schiff, who I will always think of as Toby Ziegler, shows up. And I liked Mark Maron's Jerry Wexler better. I don't know which of them is closer to the real Jerry Wexler, but Maron's Wexler just has more energy and charisma to it. And it's like the role that Maron was born to play. Whereas like Ziegler is wearing a distractingly fake looking hairpiece. This is roughly contemporary to when he was in West Wing, so we know where his hairline was as of 2004, and it looks fake.
I did not like his Wexler based on, you know, what we read about when we were doing Respect. Like, he seemed like much more of a firecracker individual, and in this he's like concerned, sad dad. Ugh. I couldn't keep track of all the different like tours he went on and groups that he went out with, and I mean, there's a lot of sort of like cyclical activity in this film where he's on the road and then he's getting ripped off. And here's where we also find out about the trauma of his childhood, where we see like he is occasionally has like, I would describe it as PTSD, where he will suddenly like be overwhelmed by feeling water, or, you know, like by remembering this terrible thing that happened when he was young. And we see him in flashback, like with his brother, and they're very close. And we see him going to learn how to play the piano in the back of a store in his hometown.
His mother is a laundress, and in a very early scene, she realizes that she is being ripped off, and she gets fired, and she says, I really liked this line, scratch a liar, find a thief.
I liked his mom a lot. I also liked that this was like the first not disappointed mother we've seen.
Yeah, she's a great mom, and I like how, I don't think the costumes in this are fabulous, but everything looks lived in, and when there are characters who are supposed to be poor, like whatever they have on looks like rags. And like also with that caveat, they show people looking like schlubby, like you're not going to be perfectly dressed to the nines every single day.
They also do something that I think movies struggle to make people look realistically poor or working class. Things you're actually struggling to get by in this world, and you're not gonna have like fabulous highlights and you're not gonna look like you just did 2 hours of yoga this morning, you know. And I think this movie did a good job of showing like a very realistic look at what poverty and what like hand-to-mouth circumstances look like in a way that wasn't like poverty porn.
Also, as we mentioned earlier, there are a lot of things here where I've realized, Respect and Get On Up got produced because of this. So things where I'm like, I've seen this before. This was the template.
And it's hard to kind of talk straight through about this movie because, as I mentioned, like the flashback sequencing of this is very, like, as I said, Inception, like where you keep going like a level deeper and then coming back out and then going back down a little bit farther and then coming back out. I don't feel like this movie pulled it off in the same way that like Get On Up did.
No. And I also feel like maybe like Get On Up was doing a timeline shuffle to look less like Ray. But also, what's really heartbreaking, Right. I don't know where things are happening in the timeline myself. When you see him lose his eyesight, it's gross. He has all this gunk around his eyes. He's constantly rubbing them. Mom is putting salve on them, which makes it worse. And I feel bad because this is a child suffering, but it's really icky, like seeing what childhood glaucoma looks like.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's really sad too.
And it's also because he's poor.
Yes. So he's touring, he's getting paid in ones. And then we have another flashback to his brother wanting to play with him and wanting to go swimming. And then his brother falls into a bucket and drowns. I was astonished by this entire chain of events.
Yeah, my assumption is that it's a giant metal bucket, quite large enough to fit a 4-year-old child. It's a wash tub. So my assumption was that he hits his head in the bucket and that's how he drowns. How do you die by drowning in a wash tub? And I feel terrible. And I also read that in real life, Ray did try to rescue George from the wash tub of doom. And now I feel like a horrible person. But Trope Navajo is on the porch.
Yeah, Trope Navajo pushed him into that bucket.
Trope Navajo held poor little George's head under the water.
Also, like, this is the first bit of anachronistic storytelling that, like, I had a real problem with. What does it serve to portray him as having gone catatonic in this moment rather than showing him struggle to rescue him and fail and go get his mom and it be too late?
Because Ray Charles had approval over the script.
But why make it weirder and more horrible?
I don't know.
Every time we do a biopic where someone has childhood trauma, and I'm excited to share this because it actually directly ties to this movie. So John Mulaney did an album in like 2005 or 2006 where he talked about taking a girl to see this movie in the theater on a date. And they walked out and he was like, "So what'd you think?" And she's like, I could have done without the whole brother dying thing. And he's like, "I bet Ray Charles could have done without the whole brother dying thing too." It's super heavy handed, but also it's like, this is what happened. But also, like, why play it so much more horrible and untrue to the way it happened?
Yeah, so there's also this, aside from the recurring motive of dead child hands and feet in water, there's also one of a tree with empty bottles hanging from it that clink, that pops up periodically. And I guess I felt like how young he was and how small his world was when he lost his eyesight, like how little he got to see while he could see.
And then he's recording, but he's not hitting it anywhere, and his contract gets sold to Atlantic Records, where we meet Ahmet Ergen. The delightful Curtis Armstrong enters the movie. And as you mentioned, Jerry Wexler returns to us, and things are starting to happen with him where he's recording. They're not really sure what to do with him because his musical style is all over the place. Like, it combines gospel with jazz and with soul and with rock and roll, and it's like a little dirty recording, and he is like starting to make his way in the world.
They say that he always sounds like he's imitating somebody else. If someone asks, what does the real Ray Charles sound like? And then we meet his future wife, Bea.
Oh, Kerry Washington.
She's
Holy
so
crap.
Good in this. And they talk about how he has a way with women where he can tell by feeling their wrist whether they're attractive. I guess part of the charm with him is that you would think, oh, he can't see that I'm hot, so he must like me for myself.
I would imagine this wrist method is flawed. but it's a tool that works really well for him. We see it used whenever he meets a woman that he's about to hook up with. He meets B and he really likes her, and he explains how his other senses have become, superpowered because he can't see, and he's talking about the things that he can hear and counting steps and, and like what he's listening for and everything. And this is talked through really well here. And then later we see how his mom taught him to do that. And it's all really powerful. He goes back to New York and he records some stuff, and then he comes back and he shows up on her doorstep and she's like, oh, hey. So they go have sex and he's wearing his sunglasses in bed, which I was like, oh, I guess he has those on all the time.
Well, his eyelids are kind of disturbing to look at. I'm sure someone must have told him that. And again, another thing that I feel terrible for saying in this episode. Yeah, he's supposed to go on tour with Ruth Brown, but Ruth Brown turns out to be pregnant. And he writes, I Got a Woman, and he's playing this for her. And she says, like, you're using this gospel sound that's supposed to be about praising the Lord to sing about sex. This is wrong. And he's telling her, well, it's the way I sing. And it reminded me of that moment in Get On Up where James Brown has the band change their hair, and Bobby Bird says to him, this is R&B hair and we're gospel.
And I Got a Woman is, for anyone keeping track out there, the song that Kanye West sampled to make Gold Digger. They fall in love. He is touring and then recording, and then he goes home and they get married, and she's pregnant really quickly.
And we have a moment of Jerry Wexler distributing a little bit of payola on the Moondog show, which I guess Wexler was no better and no worse than anyone around at the time. Someone says, like, nobody's ever combined gospel and R&B before, and this is when he goes on the Chitlin circuit.
We failed to mention the fact that he started doing heroin.
Yes, because he kept getting locked out of the restroom by people who were running in to do heroin.
Yeah, and he's just like, stick it in my veins. That sounds cool. I don't understand how people are functional on heroin, but it seems like he was very busy being creative during this time period and throughout his life.
I think different junkies deteriorate at different rates.
That sounds reasonable. Also, the thing with the payola, too, like, I fail to understand why that is so scandalous. I think, like, I always assume that because growing up and hearing the same 10 songs on the radio, I'm like, surely there's money changing hands. And who cares? Like, this is what people want us to hear.
So she wants to start a family, and then she puts up with him for a really long time. Like, when she is very pregnant, this is when she finds his bag with the heroin. And I liked that, like, when she's being a housefrau, that her hair is kind of messy. Like, she's not putting herself together all the time like she does in the younger scenes, which is just, like, what happens. But she has the baby, and it's very touching because he asks, like, can he see?
That was a really lovely moment. The best moments of his performance are when he's with Kerry Washington in this movie. Like, I really loved their chemistry and their interplay and everything. He's also catting around like a maniac on the road. Mm-hmm. He's got a couple of ladies, and eventually kind of settles in with Margie Hendricks, who is a singer in the Rayettes, or the Raylettes.
They were called the Raylettes, and they bring this up right away. One of the things that I learned listening to A History of Rock Music in 500 Songs is that the joke was that the way to become a Raylette was to let Ray.
Ha! There we go. And she is played by the magical Regina King. So good in this movie. And she also, maybe because of him, gets hooked on heroin, maybe. This is one of the few things that when Ray Charles read the initial screenplay, that he was like, hard pass, I did not get her hooked on heroin. So Margie is kind of like, I'm doing this because I want to be close to you, which is real addict conversation. He is not shown like tying her off,
No.
but she does eventually become, according to legend, hooked on heroin. I'll get to her story in a bit when we get to her demise. And, you know, and we see them touring and they have like the seminal moment of playing What I Say, which becomes like Ray Charles's breakout song, because they have to fill 20 more minutes on a bill where they're performing. And so he starts playing this. And this is one of those things. And when we do Bohemian Rhapsody, you will hear me go off on this. And I went off on it on The Doors, where just like people just like start like being like, oh, let's just play this. And all of a sudden it's this amazing song. And I don't doubt that like real artists who are real geniuses are imbued with these kinds of gifts. However, I think that a lot of artists mostly have to work really, really hard on this stuff to make it look easy. And I hate that because I don't think that it's a true reflection of how hard artists work to create. And I think that they did this really well in Rocket Man, where they show like the grind of the work that you do to create. And this movie fails every single which way to show the hard work that goes into being a performer. And no better is this encapsulated than in this scene where they just sit down and hammer out this song in front of a group of people and everybody's like, I love it. It's perfect. No notes. And this is where we see Wexler too, like when they go into the studio to record this was where I was like, this isn't the Wexler that we've read about and encountered in previous work and in the research we did for Respect, where he is so against this song and so against being inventive in it. And I'm like, Wexler invited Sidney Lumet in to follow Aretha Franklin around while she was recording a gospel album.
This is Wexler a few years before he worked with Aretha, so maybe he learned a thing or two.
And then he and B moved to LA and he records Georgia on My Mind in front of like a massive string orchestra, and it's very beautiful. And then Regina King tells him that she's pregnant and he tells her to have an abortion and she will not. And I will have you know that according to the internet and the missteps of this film, and I'm going to read you the exact language because it's amazing. In the film, when his backing singer and mistress, Margie Hendricks, informs Ray she is pregnant with his child, Ray suggests she should have an abortion. In reality, Hendricks did conceive a child with Charles and abandoned him after he refused to leave Della, but Charles never asked her to have an abortion and welcomed any child he conceived, whether from Della or any mistress, into his personal life.
I read that he had at least 12 children by at least 10 different women, and there was a 38-year age difference between the oldest and the youngest.
So he didn't probably encourage her to have an abortion, but who knows? We weren't there. And then they start pounding out Hit the Road Jack again in a moment that is just like he just sits down and starts banging that out. And then we see them performing it. And I'll tell you, if there's someone on my list of people who I never want to disappoint, it is Regina King, because the way that she is glaring at him when they are performing this song live is terrifying. But he's as high as a kite, so it doesn't matter.
Sometimes things can come to you in a moment of inspiration. Like Keith Richards tells that story that he just woke up with the riff for Satisfaction in his head. He has a Grammy nomination, and then we see Trope Navajo is in the background again, because there's that thing where everything's happening, but they're miserable. which
Yep.
happens in a lot of these. We have a flashback to his mother sending him to the school for the blind. We have a callback to where she says, like, never let nobody turn you into no cripple. And then the protests in Georgia. This also did not happen. He had a telegram. And until I read that, I thought, you know what, this is great, because he has a whole argument about why it's okay for him to play Georgia. And then it shows a person changing your mind, which is kind of idealistic, because there's nothing I find less realistic anymore than someone making a persuasive speech that causes a person to change their mind. But I thought, this shows that he's someone who can change his mind, and then it turned out this was all just created for the moment in the film.
I hated this moment because he was convinced in like about 3 back and forths with the guy to abandon the concert. Like he was like, oh, you know what? I'm joining the civil rights movement right this second. And to your point, yeah, like people get persuaded all the time by impassioned commentary. Like I've seen it happen like once.
I mean, it happens every day on Instagram.
It does. And I've also seen it happen in Facebook comments. All you have to do is like share a link to a story. This is not the way things happen, and we must stop showing it in movies.
Right, because we saw Quincy Jones couldn't persuade him a few scenes back.
Yeah, and I was concerned because the actor who was speaking to him looked a lot like Medgar Evers. This is his one interaction with Medgar Evers, but it's just a random guy who didn't actually exist because, as you said, it all happened via telegram. Also, and this is like getting into like Ty Cobb level lying here at this point, and I'm really troubled by it. He is convinced in 3 lines of dialogue to abandon his performance, and he declares he will no longer perform in segregated public facilities. And in response, supposedly, the Georgia State Legislature passes a resolution banning Charles from ever performing again in the state. In reality, so as you mentioned, the telegram, and then also he was never banned for performing in Georgia. And he still, after this, accepted invitations to perform at segregated public facilities. You have just propped your film up with a load of bullshit and propped up your thesis statement about this artist with nonsense. And it is infuriating. We're real enough to show people drifting in and out of his life in a way that like makes this film lackadaisical and slow. But we're going to like just like make up something out of whole cloth to tell this story. And then after that, we get another phone call. And this was the point where I'm like, oh no, it's about Dr. King. It's about Dr. King, because we hear him start screaming. But it turns out it is Margie Hendricks has died. She gave birth to Ray Charles's child. He's been paying for that child on the regular. And here's another bit of infuriating reality. Her character didn't die in 1963 or 1962, whenever this was. She died in 1973. No official cause of death was determined because an autopsy was not performed. So she didn't necessarily die of a drug overdose, and she certainly didn't die in the early 60s. Why do we have to make this up? Why do we have to just randomly kill this woman in the middle of this movie? Like, she could have just walked out of it like everybody else walks in and out of the movie. Like, Wendell Pierce walks out of the movie. I don't like Terrence Howard, but, like, he walks out of the movie and it's fine. Like, we never find out what the hell happened to Ray's mom. Why does Margie Hendricks have to die?
To get everything compressed into a certain span of decades, even when it did not happen in those particular decades. Somewhere in here there is another heroin arrest. We skipped over getting to Margie dying, some very good success and time passing montages, and Ray deciding to play country music.
Oh, you're right. Yes, that's a thing that happens. Sorry, I was worked up about Margie while I was on my truth-telling mission there.
It's okay. For some reason, it is harder to keep the events in this film in the order that they happened than it was in Get On Up, where the events actually are much more slice and diced than here.
This was really tough to like frame up narratively as we were watching it.
Well, I liked how they showed his decision to play country, and everyone is like, you're crazy. And also in here there was his contract with Atlantic Records runs out, and he finds another record company that is willing to give him far more than Atlantic can, and ownership of his own masters, which is a very big deal that like nobody gets.
I was so excited not to see Curtis Armstrong walk out of this movie, but to see Kurt Fuller enter this movie. This is one of my favorite character actors. He is in Ghostbusters 2, playing the aide to the mayor in that movie, and he's really funny in that. He is also the villain in the terrible, like, Hulk Hogan abortion of a movie called No Holds Barred, and he's amazing in that movie. He plays the head of ABC Records.
Yes. So he starts playing country music and he immediately wins the audience over. This touched on something that's important to me, which is like this idea that great artists don't discriminate based on subgenre. Like they can hear outside of what's in their own wheelhouse of what they perform and how they perform it. Here we meet his new stage personal manager, guru guy, Joe Adams, who hushes the audience by turning the lights all the way down. Anyway, Jeff, who has been taking care of him on the road and in life all of this time, who we have not yet mentioned, is jealous of Joe. And there's a success montage that I thought was all of the success montages in this movie are quite well done, I thought.
Joe's introduction, he's fascinating. Like, he was an actor. He won a Golden Globe for his breakout performance in Carmen Jones. He won the Best Newcomer Award at the Golden Globes, which is a defunct award. I think Pia Zadora killed it, but I'm not 100% sure. This was an interesting choice 2/3 of the way through the movie to bring this guy in, because I couldn't get a read on him for the entire movie. I was like, is this guy bad or good? And I didn't feel like we definitively had a sense of that, like whether his previous manager was bad or Joe was bad, or were they both bad, and who was telling the truth and who was lying.
Maybe the point is that everybody in showbiz rips everybody else off. There was also a nice moment in here with Ahmed, who admitted, I can't match this deal. And Jerry just walks out, but Ahmed tells him, you know what? You made it. Like, and they're just able to enjoy Ray's success as old friends.
He's a gentleman. I don't know what he's like in real life, and I'm afraid to look into it because, like, I feel like everyone in the music industry who made it to the top has probably, like, hunted humans in their spare time.
I love when he writes Mess Around, and you can see he is too big of a dork to sing this thing himself.
Oh, that was great.
And he sounds ridiculous singing it himself, but he knows someone else can do something with this. Yeah. I loved how dorky he was. I mean, I feel like we've been more out of order with talking about what is happening than anything else. And I don't know why. It has arguably more linear clarity than Get On Up did, where we were quite clear on things with this.
I disagree, because I think Get On Up, even though it was wildly out of syncopation, I think that they made it incredibly clear why they chose the sequence that they did.
Mm-hmm.
And they also changed the look and feel of those scenes in a way that was really meaningful. This is more disorganized. This is like the most sequentially messy movie we've watched.
I think everything rides on Jamie Foxx's performance, which is fantastic.
Yes.
I feel like every bit of like cred or whatever the movie had to sink was all around that one performance.
I mean, I don't know that there's a world where this movie even gets made without Jamie Foxx.
Oh, So there are still happy moments in the marriage. I noted that when Margie dies, like, Bee seems more aghast and worried about the baby than Ray does. And Joe starts charging band members for being late, as James Brown did. And then there is a trope Navajo moment of not showing up at your kid's baseball game. There are 2 drug arrests, at least, in this movie. Worst one is federal. And I've noticed that, like, Ray has this constant threat of violence about him. Like, when he is with a woman and they're disagreeing, I'm just constantly worried from his body language. Like, yes. It captures... I liked that he doesn't come across as, like, a very nice person, but he also is a traumatized person. And also this bit where, like, Della, where B is telling him that, like, he loves his music the most and he's going to lose that. But it's also a get off drugs speech. And I wondered about, like, that trope of the first wife who doesn't understand them. You don't and then I realized, oh, wait a minute. It's that woman who was ripping him off and using him for sex at the beginning. And there's a sequence of being dope sick that, like, Fox carries off pretty well, even though this is something that could dissolve again into Dewey Cox cliche territory. It's all riding on Fox pulling it off. Well, and because also the material is being presented in a way where if they had a less effective actor, it would not be strong.
We veer, like, way into, like, artist falls fallow in his drug addiction and attempts to get clean stereotypes here, where, like, his mother comes out and his dead brother comes out and they're all telling him to, like, to get himself together. And I've learned from the Respect episode that I need to not like this.
One thing I will give it, at least he hugs his memory of little George and not himself as a child.
At least.
I appreciated that, because we all know me screaming, "Don't hug the inner child," is a common thing in these movies.
This movie heard you, though, when you were screaming it, because he didn't do it.
He did not hug his younger self. And I guess we saw how handsome Jamie Foxx is, because there's this one scene where since he's in the inner vision world, he's playing like himself as he would be with those beautiful big brown eyes.
This is going to sound like really like bitch eating crackers. I was thinking about it last night because I was trying to do the math on, like, whether or not, like, this was a good, like, acting performance or just a really good facsimile of Ray Charles. Like, if there was more that he was bringing to it. And it really wasn't until we actually saw his eyes that I felt like it was an acting performance, because there's something that makes a performance really remote when you can't see someone's eyes. Technically, it's a very accomplished performance. Like, the singing and the piano playing and the physicality, and, you know, he worked very hard to understand what it was like to be blind. I felt very removed from Ray Charles beyond a caricature, because he's, like, behind the glasses. And listen, I get it. Like, I get how stupid that sounds.
But he was wearing glasses all the time. And when I thought about it, the Ray Charles that you saw in public was as a performer, but it shows him in private where he's being a jerk. Fox still made me care about him, since he was acting things that there wasn't anything for him to imitate. Just an approximation of how this man would act in private life.
This was a script problem. This was not a Jamie Foxx problem. I felt like they brought up how pissed off he was about being blind really late in the game. Like, I checked the time on that and it was like, we are less than 20 minutes from the end of this movie, including the credits right now. And he has just acknowledged for the first time that he is angry AF at God for his blindness. Yes.
I think so, because way back that first time he shoots heroin where they're telling him don't do it, he yells about, like, I'm in the dark, like, that he's miserable and that he wants to feel that. And they tell him, careful, it's better than sex. And he's like, ain't nothing better than sex.
But that's all we have of that. Like, I guess, like, he is, like, pissed off the entire movie because he treats everyone around him like crap and is constantly pointing out that he's being ripped off. I mean, in a way, like, I think that his fear of so many things is probably keeping him from being very nice to people or really letting them in.
I think the anger was implicit the whole way, that in the way that he's constantly suspicious of people, and honestly, rightly, because artists got ripped off. Like, even with all of his canniness, he still would get ripped off. It's in how ornery he is. It's in the way he treats people. It's in the way that he's looking out for number one. It's in the way that he won't give up the drug because he needs to cancel himself out.
He was just a jerk the whole movie. And we saw why he was charismatic, and we saw how charming he was. But, you know, we never really saw him make that turn because he doesn't detox until very quickly before the end of the movie.
Yeah, and then it kind of runs out quite rapidly. There's the doctor playing chess with him. There is Trope Navajo is watching him throw a table because furniture smashing happens in all these movies. And then it shows Georgia rescinding a punishment it never actually imposed, and B kisses him even though they were divorced at this point. And I was thinking, is this omission, or are they saying they're still married? Because ex-spouses who are still on friendly terms can have a moment, but she finally decided she couldn't take him anymore around a few years before this moment of being honored by the state of Georgia actually happened.
Well, yes, I will actually back this up. She was not there when he performed.
She was not there.
At the Georgia State Legislature. It's such a galling fiction. You know, I know we can't do without the whole brother dying thing, but we can do without the whole I got banned from performing in the state of Georgia. Oops, no, I didn't. Just kidding. Added this to make this more dramatic.
This is actually making me appreciate a lack of tropes in Coal Miner's Daughter.
Yeah.
I wonder if we might give that a higher score if we were watching it now, realizing how many of these things that skirted around.
It is Ty Cobb level obscene to make up this entire series of events. If you ever see the movie Hurricane, about Reuben Hurricane Carter, like there's an evil cop that movie just completely makes up in order to make his story seem more tragic and more triumphant. And Hurricane Carter's story is shitty enough without the fake like Javert in it. Ray Charles's story is traumatic and crappy enough without the whole Georgia banned me, but then once they made my song the state song, they said that they were wrong. Also, and this was another thing I was thinking about after the movie, is like whenever you see people get clean in these movies, I'm always like, did they stay clean? You know, like they kick the habit and present it as like a once and for all, I've kicked the habit thing in a lot of these movies where someone is inevitably an addict and then recovers from it. So he did quit heroin. However, he did abuse alcohol, gin and marijuana specifically as substitutes for heroin throughout his life, which I don't have a problem with that. But like to present like this sort of like triumphant, like I've overcome all of this. And the state of Georgia has apologized to me for an offense that they didn't actually commit.
Well, I can accept that though, because so far as I could tell, it was only heroin that made him problematic.
I hate the way that like addiction is shown as a binary in so many of these movies. And I feel like Respect and Get On Up both did it better in that like Get On Up never made any pretense that he stopped smoking angel dust, which James Brown certainly did not stop smoking angel dust. This movie made it seem like once he kicked heroin, everything was cool again. Like his wife was like, you know what? It's cool. I'm sticking around. No, she didn't.
Yeah, it kind of like winds very quickly to the end after he quits the heroin, even though that is where they show the furniture destruction scene. So many perfectly innocent pieces of furniture suffer for artistic growth.
The way you just said that sounded like the Sally Struthers commercials from the late 80s. These children are innocent, and they suffer at the hands of artists who need to express their pain. You too can save the life of this chair for 50 cents a day. I was really put off by the things they chose to fictionalize and also by the pace of it. Like, I don't know. Not everything needs to be a movie, I guess. Like, this was a super duper passion project for Taylor Hackford. Like, he spent years trying to get this movie made. There's other Taylor Hackford movies that I think are better, like which we talked about during Gandhi. We talked about An Officer and a Gentleman. This is such an and then-y biopic, but also like the structure of it is so messy. The things that they chose to fictionalize are mystifying and strange. There's just so much repetitive motion. Like, I got ripped off. I'm on a bus. I'm touring. I'm making up a new song. Like, there's just so much of that. I'm being a dick, but this wasn't for me.
It's okay. It's okay, Sarah. It's over.
Yes, it is. You're right. Did you have any choice dialogue from this motion picture?
I did have 4 pieces of choice dialogue. I liked Scratch a Liar, Find a Thief. I liked when Ray says, if I feel the music, then that means it's real. And I liked his speech about why he loves country music, where he says, I love the stories, about falling in love and having love knock you around and the pressure of the world on you so that it makes you feel small. You want to give your soul to God. You might as well. Your ass belongs to him anyway. And just how that, like, wins over these racists in the country music session, that they're like, oh, he gets us regardless. Maybe because both kinds of music come from suffering. I think it was Tyler Mahanco from the Cocaine and Rhinestones podcast who said that when people say, oh, I like all kinds of music except for country and rap, what they're really saying is, I don't like music by poor people.
It's a heck of a good insight.
And then one more thing that Ray says. I like to hear a person saying it needed to be done as opposed to it ain't my job.
I like all of the things that you just said. I will add a line to that. And I do feel like I really appreciated the portrayal of his mother in this. And she said to him, I'll show you how to do something once. I'll help you if you mess up twice. But the third time you're on your own, because that is how it is in the world. And she says this, and it's just before like an incredibly effective sequence where we see him fall and start asking for his mother while he's in their home and trying to figure out where he's going and how to get there. And she has to just sit there, and you see her struggling to not help him and how painful that is to listen to him crying. But then he pulls himself together and he gets himself up and starts like paying attention. And I thought like the portrayal of his mother was really wonderful. And I loved that line and how she stuck with it in spite of how horrible it is. I am going to give our listeners a quick refresher about how we score movies. We rate our movies on a 1 to 10 scale across 10 areas that we find to be subjectively or objectively important to most films, but especially tailored to specific issues particular to biopics. If you want more details on how we score movies, please scroll down on our webpage at biopicapodcaststory.podbean.com. You'll also find a record of our scores for past episodes.
Also, highly recommend listening to our special introductory episode, Introduction, Who Are We and What Are We Doing?, where we give a rundown of the methodology, why it matters to us, and some inspirations behind this podcast.
And with that out of the way, let's score this thing.
Okay, so for outward appearances, I gave it a 7. I liked a lot of touches here. I thought that the prosthetic shut eyes looked real. So the hairpiece that Toby Ziegler wore as Jerry Wexler was very off. And there's also a part where Ahmed has a beard that looks like it's painted on.
Same, I gave it a 7.
For acting and casting, I gave it a 9. Everybody did a fantastic job. Jamie Foxx was believable. The little deduction was for just a few missteps and for how much I missed Mark Maron as Jerry Wexler.
Same, I gave it a 9.
Oh, for passage of time, I gave it a 7, which I'm now starting to feel might not have been justified.
I gave it a 6, and I am also, the more I talked about it, feeling like that's a little generous.
For costuming, I gave it a 7. It delivered, but it didn't stun me the way that some other films have.
I gave it an 8. For quality of the script, I gave it a 5.
I gave it a 6. For accuracy, I gave it a 3.75. I don't know if it was fair of me to score it beneath Caligula, but we know a lot more about things that happened as they happened in the mid-20th century than we do about the first century.
And what they could get right in Caligula, they did get right. This, accuracy, 3.
Yes.
Yes.
For storytelling, I gave it a 6, which I now feel was generous.
I gave it a 3.
For production value, I gave it a 7. Stuff looks good, but I wasn't impressed. Like, I was actually way more impressed with what Race did with far less than with what I saw here.
I also gave it a 7. And in the same boat. And also, like, I respect that it was an independent production and that, like, actual, like, the money was on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, was I blown away by it? No.
For production, direction, decision-making, 6.25, which I'm again feeling might have been overgenerous, and I think it mostly had to do with the casting and and as a reflection of other things that I thought were decently done, since it is sort of a combo.
Yeah, I gave it a 7 for the production and direction decision making, which is largely because of the incredibly talented cast behind this film. And I did think some of the ways that things were shot were inventive. And like there's like so many really good moments. It's just like the whole of it doesn't hold together for me. Jamie Foxx is like 6 of the 7 points here that I give this. I don't know that a better decision could have been made.
And that's really the most important one, and that's why for Do We Care, I gave it a 9, because despite the character being a jerk, I felt all of the pain that was behind that. I felt intrigued and enchanted watching the story of someone so talented. And I loved hearing the musical references. I cared.
I gave it a 7 for Do I Care, because I felt ultimately kind of manipulated by the shit that they made up or like deeply fictionalized. Like, I know, like, we've talked on this show and you have spoken more eloquently on it than I about like the role of omission versus fictionalization. And I feel like this really kind of abused our trust on that.
My average came to 6.8.
Mine came to a 5.6. So
the average comes to 6.3. Ray, you did not earn second opinion.
Sorry, Ray. Is there anything else that you would recommend that people watch instead of or in supplement to this? film.
Respect was a better movie. If you're looking for something similar, and you can refer back to episode 4, which we did on that. This is going to sound like it came from out of nowhere, but remember that SNL skit where Tom Hanks is on Black Jeopardy and he shows up in a MAGA hat?
Yes.
And I think because I see a parallel to this about Ray getting country up until they get to the things about specifics where Tom Hanks's character needs to feel like he has these identity signifiers that put him above. They're finding tons of commonality in that skit, which I will link to in the show notes. Even though, again, this feels like I'm having a non sequitur moment, and that reminded me also of Lyndon Johnson's famous quote about, you can take money from the hand of the poorest white man as long as you tell him he's better than the best black man. I see the relation. I don't know if anyone else will.
I see the relation, and I appreciate how much you thought about his entry into country music and everything. And I also think that there's something really smart about like artists who can really appreciate all genres for what they are and how they all connect together. And I do really love how Ray Charles did that. Go watch any of The Wire or any of Treme so you can see much more Wendell Pierce. Go out and watch anything with Kerry Washington. This Jamie Foxx performance it's worth seeing, even though this movie, like, to me, was very meandering and hitting on the same points over and over.
Sarah, who would you rather sit behind at the movies? Wendell Pierce or Craig Robinson?
Oh, shut up. Don't ask me that question. I don't know. Can one of them sit next to me if the other one is sitting in front of me? Can they be sitting together? I guess it also depends on what kind of movie we're seeing, too. Like, I feel like Craig Robinson, you want to sit behind if you're seeing something that's terrible. Like, if I were to go see Cats again, I think I would want Craig Robinson to be sitting in front of me.
Oh, I would love that, too, because we saw Cats together. Remember?
Yeah.
What movie would you want to sit behind Wendell Pierce?
Okay, let's see. I think like Wendell Pierce, I would want to sit behind him in like a faux pretentious Oscarbatory drama.
Yes.
Like a latter era Coppola movie.
I would like to sit behind Wendell Pierce at a screening of The Hours.
Yes. I don't know Wendell Pierce personally. He seems like he doesn't have a lot of time for anybody's bullshit. So like, I think watching anything where people are just like in their bullshit, like whether that's a Nancy Meyers movie or it's a movie about kids in art school or a Whit Stillman film or a latter era Woody Allen movie. Like, I think he would be fun to sit behind while people are just like going off on trying to sound really smart and pretentious. But Craig Robinson, like, I want to see Megalopolis sitting behind Craig Robinson.
Not Wendell Pierce.
No. Wendell Pierce, like Craig Robinson, I want to see a movie that is a total fiasco. Wendell Pierce, pretentious nonsense. I want to be clear, though. I would sit behind either of them at the movies and be fulfilled in a way that could make me be like, I'm okay to die now.
Agreed.
On that note, if you like the show, please leave us a 5-star rating and subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And tell a friend, or better yet, plural friends, and share us on social media. We hear it helps. You can follow us on Instagram, where we have visual aids from our episodes. Our Instagram handle is at Biopic a Podcast Story. So do check us out there, and we'll link to that in the show notes as well. Please also check out our webpage at biopicapodcaststory.podbean.com to see the official episode ratings for all of the episodes that we have done so far. And if you would like to get in touch, You can email us at biopiclistenermailbag@gmail.com.
Tune in next week when we'll be talking about Liz and Dick, starring Lindsay Lohan.
Oh my God. Speaking of framing devices.
Ooh, black box.
Black box, like Alex P. Keaton style black box. I think there's some other ones in there too. Like it is a mess of framing devices.
Oh boy.
Is
it going to beat Gotti at the framing device Olympics?
It's up there. I recall at least 2 framing devices.
Because Gotti had at least 4.
I don't think it has 4, but it definitely has more than 1. Okay. Well, have a wonderful evening. And
you too.
Love you and talk to you soon.
Yes. See you soon, Sarah. Bye-bye.
Bye.